Good morning, everyone. I'm Hawley Johnson, Associate Director of Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. It is a privilege to welcome you to the 10-year anniversary celebration of our initiative. This event marks a decade of significant collaboration, notably with UNESCO and Guilherme Canela, which has greatly contributed to our growth and the strengthening of our efforts. The day-long event is being generously live-cast by the Internet Society, so I would like to extend a warm welcome to all our online guests and thank the Internet Society for their kind support. And thank you all for joining us today under what are undoubtedly extraordinary circumstances. Given the current turbulence, both here and on campuses across the United States, we were faced with a challenging decision, whether to postpone or even cancel today's event. However, we decided it was crucial to convene as a community to reflect on the international norms and best practices to protect freedom of expression. The title of today's event, Safeguarding Freedom of Expression, the Role of Judicial Systems in Pivotal Times, speaks directly to the critical juncture at which we find ourselves, not only for our university, but also for the broader landscape of democracy. This includes the rise of populism and authoritarianism, as well as the threats posed by climate change and artificial intelligence. These are formidable challenges to humanity, demanding attention and action. It is not a time to be silent, but to speak out in defense of international norms on freedom of expression. The international human rights system was established following World War II to codify principles and practices to guide states in protecting fundamental rights. Today, our aim is to reaffirm and reflect on those standards. When tensions rise, we need them most. While we are based at an American institution, our initiative has a global perspective. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is our touchstone. So bear with me, as I think it's important at this time to take a moment to recall its fundamental freedom of expression principles. Article 19, paragraph 1 states that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Paragraph 2 states everyone shall have the right of freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to speak, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of choice. Article 21 protects the right to peaceful assembly. These rights, however, are not absolute and do come with restrictions. Thus, Article 19, paragraph 3 states that the exercise of these rights carries with it special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such that are provided by law, clearly defined, and are necessary and proportional to protect certain enumerated rights and societal interests. In recent years and days, we have all had to think about what are the necessary and proportionate restrictions on freedom of expression in democratic societies. The thresholds on when to act are not often clear and are often contentious. International human rights law does provide some guidance. Article 20 of the ICCPR, for instance, prohibits propaganda for war, as well as advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. While there is no international consensus on when speech becomes dangerous, the Rabat Plan of Action offers a 6-part threshold test on the distinction between freedom of expression and the incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence. These are the principles that global freedom of expression seeks to advance. Global freedom of expression was launched in 2014 by our visionary and steadfast founding director, Dr. Agnes Callamard, and then president of Columbia University and First Amendment scholar, Lisi Bollinger. Since its founding, the initiative has sought to strengthen global norms on freedom of expression in order to safeguard the global public sphere, as well as to build bridges across multiple jurisdictions and disciplines. By focusing on the institutions of justice and surveying and analyzing related international, regional, and national jurisprudence, the initiative contributes to a comparative understanding of global trends. Key achievements over the last years include the development of our now flagship global case law database, which on average has between 5,000 and 7,000 views per day. The Justice for Freedom of Expression conferences, the establishment of the Global Freedom of Expression prizes, a massive open online course on edX, and the publication of an edited volume, Regardless of Frontiers, Global Freedom of Expression in a Troubled World. Today, we are privileged to have with us an incredible community of legal and issue area experts whose contributions have been invaluable. While Dr. Agnes Kalamard could not join us, we are pleased to welcome my former colleague, Bach Vezjanov, who joined us in 2015, and several other founding supporters, including several speakers here today, as well as Dr. Doreen Weissenhaus, Peter Misek, Bob Balin, Dinah Pohn-Kepner, Karen Karlaker, among others. Unfortunately, some of our core supporters could not be present today, but are with us in spirit, including Judge Fernando Biocalti, Barbara Bukowska, Dr. Abelter Godioli, David Kay, Tarlik McGonigal, Jacob Mishingama, Dario Milo, Peter Norlander, Judge Darian Pavley, Monroe Price, Professor Emeritus Dr. Dirk Voorhoef, and John Yegansu. We have a very exciting two-part program today. Our joint conference with UNESCO will run until 3:30, with a break for the networking lunch and a book conversation. The conference will then be followed by the 2024 Global Freedom of Expression Prize ceremony starting at 4 p.m. Today's panels will review landmark decisions from the past decade that have strengthened democratic governance and freedom of expression, and they will explore how courts can constructively address the challenges that lie ahead. True critical thinking involves examining all sides and fostering a space for dialogue. This approach is essential to ensure that we are making moral choices. Today, we aim to engage in such critical discussions, examining the robust role judicial systems can play during these turbulent times. So thank you for your commitment to this dialogue, and we look forward to a day of thoughtful and productive discussions. Our next speaker was supposed to be Catalina Botero Marina, our dear former director. She unfortunately has fallen ill and is unable to be with us today, but she did ask that I convey some of her remarks, so I will be brief. Sorry to continue to talk. She wanted me to convey that for a decade now, the initiative has been at the forefront of academic research and the dissemination of global standards and best practices on freedom of expression. Over this period, Columbia Global Freedom of Expression and UNESCO have jointly developed incredible resources that seek to widen and deepen our understanding of this core value that underlies all democratic societies. We could not have had a better ally than UNESCO. From the very beginning of our initiative, UNESCO has been and still is a key partner in our cause. Their invaluable support throughout the years has allowed us to realize a diverse range of projects that strengthen freedom of expression. UNESCO's sponsorship has been instrumental to the evolution of Columbia Global Freedom of Expression's database, which as of today hosts over 2,200 case analyses in English of significant court decisions from over 130 countries. In her role as the Dean of Los Andes Law School and the UNESCO Chair on Freedom of Expression, she led a team of researchers to develop the Spanish language database and to provide materials for UNESCO's judges programs. And that database now hosts more than 400 case analyses of landmark decisions. And UNESCO has further supported the linguistic expansion of the database into other languages, including Arabic, French, Russian, and Portuguese. To provide positive models and highlight best practices for their training programs, UNESCO has also helped the database grow thematically. Our partnership allowed us to add relevant case analyses into the database on emerging issues such as SLAPS, elections, COVID-19, and access to information, privacy, mis and disinformation, among many others. Further, this alliance was essential for securing outreach and cooperation with the Inter-American System of Human Rights, the African System on Human and People's Rights, and the European Court of Human Rights, ensuring that the database now hosts the most significant freedom of expression-related case law from those regional systems. That collaboration enabled the creation of the special collection of the case law on freedom of expression, a paper series that systematizes the case law in the database to offer a global outlook of some of the most significant legal decisions adopted by national and international tribunals. Columbia Global Freedom of Expression has also hosted many important conferences and events to share knowledge on critical issues. Back in 2022, under her leadership, Global Freedom of Expression and the World Leaders Forum, with the support of UNESCO, hosted a two-part conference to promote dialogue, as well as the exchange of experiences and best practices between domestic and international courts. Most recently, Columbia Global Freedom of Expression hosted over 20 webinars supported by UNESCO. Webinars in Spanish for the Latin American audience were done in partnership with Fundación para la Libertad de Prensa in Colombia. A webinar series in Portuguese and English was launched in partnership with the Sao Paulo School of Judges. Another series designed for audience in the Middle East and North Africa was done in cooperation with the Price Media Moot Court and Ain Shams Law School in Cairo, Egypt. Lastly, a series in French for Francophone audiences was conducted in collaboration with Article 19 West Africa. All of these endeavors embody the commitment to democracy and the rule of law that sustains this partnership between Columbia Global Freedom of Expression and UNESCO. So with that, I will now introduce Guilherme Canela, our next speaker, and he is going to join us remotely. So Guilherme is our long-term partner, and he is the chief of the section of Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists, Communication and Information Sector at UNESCO in Paris. Previously, he held the position of Communication and Information Regional Advisor for Latin America and the Caribbean at UNESCO Montevideo office. During those years, he was the regional coordinator of the UNESCO Initiative for the Promotion of Democracy and Freedom of Expression in Judicial Systems in Latin America. When the Global Case Law Database was under development, UNESCO's Judges Initiative had just launched the previous year. Discussions between Agnes Calamard and Guilherme Canela revealed synergies and great opportunities to cooperate on developing training resources for the Judges Initiative based on a shared vision of the power of the judiciary to expand protections for fundamental rights and for those defending democracy, such as journalists, whistleblowers, and human rights defenders. And the rest is history, they say. So thank you so much, Guilherme, and I give you the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Real pity I can't be with you. Would be a great pleasure to join this celebratory moment of this 10th anniversary of the Global Freedom of Expression initiative at Columbia University. What else I can say after Hawley already describing everything we have been doing together these last 10 years. So since I'm not a lawyer, maybe I'm more a storyteller, let me just tell you a few stories in this, in these opening remarks. As Hawley said, we were developing more than 10 years ago, actually, with the two special rapporteurs of freedom of expression of that time, coincidentally, Catalina Botero and Frank LaRue, this idea that we needed to do something to support the judicial operators, particularly judges and prosecutors, to have a better understanding of the international standards of freedom of expression. So at the end of 2012, we started talking with some chief justices all over the world to understand that at that time, particularly in Latin America, but already checking with others, what UNESCO could do differently, what we could do that would be useful for them. And three things were very recurrent in these conversations with them. First, there was a more institutional element that we need to approach the international courts, like the International Human Rights Courts, there were another element, or Supreme Courts and so on. There was another element very important to what then became the UNESCO Judges Initiative, that is the work with the judicial schools that we have been doing a lot. I will come back to that in a minute. And the third element of this conversation was judges are very used to work with comparative jurisprudence. So you also need to take this into consideration while UNESCO, is preparing what now we call the Judges Initiative. So we came back with this homework after these conversations, and I was talking to a dear friend of mine that you all know, the lawyer Thais Gasparian from Brazil, who is an expert on freedom of expression issues. And I told her this story that different chief justices all over the world were telling us what would be useful for them. And Thais told me, look, I know Agnes Callamar and Liu Bollinger are thinking about creating a jurisprudence data bank at Columbia University. And I said, wow, this is perfect, because then we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So I immediately called Agnes and told her, look, Agnes, we will have a meeting with directors of schools of judges from all over Latin America in Uruguay. Can you join and explain what you have in mind, and maybe we can work together? So as Hawley said, the rest is history. Agnes did join that meeting in Montevideo 10 years ago, precisely when Colombia was creating this initiative. And we started working together, and I won't repeat what Hawley just said, first with the possibility of having more documents and cases in Spanish, and then expanding the outreach. But above all, the most important thing is really including the Columbia initiative as part of our training for judges and prosecutors, so they could use more and more these elements in their daily lives when they are taking decisions about freedom of expression issues or prosecuting cases that are related to these elements. So let me tell you another story that just happened this weekend. One of these judges, that is an alumni of our courses, called me and said, look, I have a particular case. I went to the Columbia database and I found all these different decisions about that, which is helping me a lot. I just want to make sure that you think those decisions are very interesting. And I said, yes, I think it's the case. And then a few days later, the judge sent to me her decision, and she was using a lot of the elements of the database in this particular case. And this anecdote is not an isolated case. It's really part of what we have been listening all over the world. We have already engaged 36,000 judges and prosecutors in this UNESCO Judges Initiative. And Mehdi, my colleague, is there with you. He can confirm how much during these 10 years or now 11 years of the Judges Initiative, judges have been telling us how useful this tool is for them, particularly the availability in different languages. So to conclude, we are in the eve of the World Press Freedom Day next week. This year is dedicated to the relationship between freedom of expression and the environmental crisis. And one thing that Hawley just said, new issues like SLAPs or elections and so on, have been just showing how important it is to keep this project going on. We are going to launch next week special research showing, for instance, how SLAPs are particularly impacting journalists doing environmental coverage. So again, an important element to keep connecting with these special collections, with new cases to the database. To find out, so this event that you are having in Colombia today is particularly important in this momentum connected with the World Press Freedom Day, where we are trying to again call attention to specific issues and the role of the judiciary and other judicial actors in this situation. Next week in Santiago de Chile, we will have a special session in the Chilean Supreme Court to again connect these issues. Final thing, I couldn't end without thanking everyone, Agnes, Catalina, Hawley, your team, Columbia University, but also several of the donors of the UNESCO Judges Initiative throughout the years. We started with Ford Foundation, and then OSF, and then several donors under our multi-donor program on freedom of expression and safety of journalists. Without them, any of these would be possible. And of course, my fantastic team in Paris and different UNESCO offices all over the world, including Mehdi, who is there with you. So thank you so much. We also connected this with our Global Media Defense Fund this year. So it's really interesting to see this connection also with the Judges Initiative and our program for supporting lawyers, since this database is useful for all the different judicial operators. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic event this morning and later a great prize ceremony. Back to you, Hawley.
In the world of freedom of expression, there are few who have acted or advocated as forcefully to defend the right than our next speaker, Aryeh Neier. Aryeh Neier's remarkable career in human rights advocacy and freedom of expression spans several decades and includes key roles in influential organizations. Before becoming the president of the Open Society Institute and the Soros Foundation in September of 1993, Neier spent 12 years as executive director of Human Rights Watch, which he helped found in 1978. Prior to that, he worked at the American Civil Liberties Union for 15 years, serving as its national executive director for 8 years. Born in Nazi Germany and a refugee from an early age, Neier has become an internationally recognized expert on human rights. He has conducted investigations into human rights abuses in over 40 countries and has been a staunch advocate for international humanitarian law and accountability, playing a significant role in the establishment of the International Tribunal for War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity in the former Yugoslavia. His life's work not only underscores the importance of freedom of expression and human rights, but also demonstrates the impact of committed advocacy on global standards of justice and accountability. Thank you, Aryeh. The floor is yours.
As Hawley indicated, my work in the rights field goes back several decades. And if you will indulge me, I would like to draw upon that experience in making a few comments about the situation today at this university, before I say a little bit about the global challenges to freedom of expression today. I think the events at this university indicate that there are challenges to freedom of expression here in the United States, as well as in other countries. My work goes back to the period when members of Congress used their positions in the Congress to demagogically harass people who were considered to be associated with organizations that were leftist or not supportive of some of the policies of the United States. It goes back to the period of the McCarthy hearings in the United States and the hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And in those years, members of Congress postured and harassed individuals at universities and in other institutions about their loyalty to the United States. I think the developments in the last few days indicate that there are members of Congress today who are willing to proceed along the same path. I think that people like Representative Virginia Fox and Representative Elise Stefanik are misusing the powers of Congress to engage in such harassment. Representative Fox has said, with respect to universities, that the Congress will hold them accountable. I see nothing in the Constitution of the United States that gives the Congress the power to hold anyone accountable other than in its impeachment powers with respect to officers of the federal government. It certainly doesn't have those powers as far as the Constitution is concerned. The role of the Congress is to legislate, not to hold anyone accountable. And I think that the President of Colombia made a mistake in trying to appease demagogic members of Congress. It doesn't work. And I think that is part of the problem that we have today. I think the effort to appeasement was mistaken in calling in the police to evict what I understand to have been peaceful protesters who were not disrupting classes or other important activities at the university. And I think it was improper appeasement to suspend large numbers of students. And I also think that it was inappropriate for the president of the university to discuss the positions of individual faculty members before a hearing of the United States Congress. So clearly there are limits on protest activities. Those activities may not include intimidation or threats. They may not include harassment of students or faculty or others in the university. They may not include incitement to violence. When there are specific cases of activity of that sort, it is appropriate for a university to take action, but it is not appropriate for a university to have peaceful protesters arrested. I want to reflect on that in 1968, when there were occupations of buildings at Columbia, I was then at the American Civil Liberties Union, and I remember being called by an aide to the mayor and being told that that evening the police would probably conduct a raid at Columbia. And so I went to the university that evening, and at 11 o'clock at night nothing had happened, so I went home. And the police raid took place at 2 o'clock in the morning, about 3 hours after I left the university campus. But the police then acted with extreme violence, and at the Civil Liberties Union, we engaged in legal representation of students for a period of months and even years after that raid on the campus took place, and we published a major report on police on campus at that time. And I think it had been understood after those events that calling in the police would be an absolutely last resort at the university, and that before it were done, the university president would consult with the university senate and also with student groups on the campus to see if there were ways of resolving problems without calling in the police. Unfortunately, that seems to have been disregarded, and I think that was a great mistake. Clearly, these protests have spread to other universities around the country. That was a predictable result. There have been unfortunate statements on this matter by various people. For example, the director of the Anti-Defamation League has published an article describing as anti-Semitism chants of free Palestine or ceasefire now. That conflation of a position on the current developments in Gaza with anti-Semitism is, I think, entirely inappropriate and is part of the difficulty. And I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel has also chimed in now, not helpfully. I hope that this university will manage to overcome these problems. This university, particularly under the leadership of Lee Bollinger, was the outstanding institution in the United States promoting freedom of expression. The establishment of the Global Freedom of Expression program is one example of that. The establishment of the Knight Institute, which has become the leading litigation institution dealing with free speech in the digital age in the United States, is another indication of the leadership at this university. And I hope this university again provides leadership in this field. Let me now take a few moments to talk a little more broadly about the threat to freedom of expression today. We have contradictory developments. We have, on the one hand, regional court systems in Europe and Latin America and in Africa that have made great strides in the protection of freedom of expression. And today, litigating on behalf of freedom of expression in those courts and in the national courts, which take their lead from the international courts, has been of immense significance in protecting freedom of expression. On the other hand, we have a number of large countries which have been particularly repressive in the recent past. I would cite 5 of those countries. I would cite Russia, China, India, Turkey, and Mexico. And then a word or two about each of those countries. In Russia, during the Soviet period, there were, in the post-Stalin period, there were people sent to prison for exercising freedom of expression. But in the post-Stalin period, from Stalin's death in 1953 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was no case that I can think of in which someone was killed because of their exercise of freedom of expression. And yet, in the current period, under Vladimir Putin, the most recent killing was of Alexei Navalny, and apparently he was continuing to be able to communicate a few ideas, even from a prison beyond the Arctic Circle, and with a 19-year prison sentence in front of him, that was not enough. And Alexei Navalny, as everyone knows, was killed. And before Alexei Navalny was killed, there were a number of other prominent dissenters. Boris Nemtsov, the journalist Anna Politkovskaya, and others were killed under Vladimir Putin. And even those who have been sentenced to prison have been sentenced to extraordinary sentences that go beyond anything that took place in the Soviet Union in the post-Stalin period. So that Vladimir Kara-Murza has been sentenced to 25 years in prison for his efforts to criticize the war in Ukraine. As far as China is concerned, whatever movement there had been towards the rule of law and protection of freedom of expression has been reversed since the advent of Xi Jinping. And to cite one case recently that indicates the situation of freedom of expression in China, a professor of economics was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison for an article in which he questioned the financial expenditure on government salaries. To mention India, India is regularly referred to as the world's largest democracy. It has elections underway today, and yet India has been the site of more internet shutdowns than any other country in the world. And to use a particular case as an example, the BBC recently ran a broadcast dealing with Prime Minister Modi's role while he was the chief executive of Gujarat in dealing with Muslims in that province. And that was soon followed by a raid on the offices of the BBC by tax inspectors in India. To cite the case of Turkey, Turkey in recent years has generally vied for the status of being the country that imprisons the largest number of journalists. I understand that at this moment there are 43 journalists who are imprisoned in Turkey, supposedly for engaging in terrorism. And of course, Turkey defies the orders of the European Court of Human Rights, so that my colleague and friend, Osman Kavala, has been in prison now for the last 7 years, and the European Court of Human Rights has directed his release more than once, and he remains in prison. And to cite the case of Mexico, it seems to be the most dangerous country in which to be a journalist. There are more journalists who are killed in Mexico, so far as I know, than in any other country. I gather during the first 9 months of the past year, 8 journalists were killed in Mexico, and that kind of killing of journalists and killing of human rights defenders in Mexico has been a phenomenon that has continued from year to year. So on the one hand, we have courts in different parts of the world, principally in the Western Hemisphere, in Africa and in Europe, that are protecting freedom of expression. On the other hand, we have some of the largest and most powerful countries of the world engaging in practices that are extremely detrimental to freedom of expression. So we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Aryeh, for your wise words. and for your perspective, and we're deeply appreciative of your attendance here today. So I'd like to invite the first panelists up to the stage. And the first panel is going to take a retrospective look at some of the most influential court decisions over the last decade that have advanced protections for freedom of expression regionally, globally, and especially as they relate to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Our Justice for Freedom of Expression conferences traditionally included regional panels to offer a comparison of regional developments. We've also been cooperating with UNESCO since 2018 to track progress on the SDGs through our database. And so we hope this discussion will bring us up to date on regional progress. And we have the perfect person here to lead that discussion, Mehdi Benchela, Senior Project Officer and the Section for Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists at UNESCO. He coordinates the Rule of Law, Policy, Freedom of Expression team, the Media and Elections Program, the Judges Initiative, a global strategy for the judiciary systems on freedom of expression, access to information and safety of journalists by fostering strategic partnerships with regional human rights courts, Supreme Courts, judicial training institutes, and prosecutors' offices across the world. The floor is all yours, Mehdi. Thank you.
1, 2, 3. Okay, hello. Thanks, Hawley. Thanks for organizing all this and doing all the nitty-gritty and with your team, because I know it's a lot of work. So first, I really want to thank you and all the people participating for this event. So hello, my name is Mehdi Benchela. So I'm a Senior Project Officer at UNESCO within the Section for Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists. And I coordinate the team working on rule of law, policy, and freedom of expression. And basically, we work a lot with judges, prosecutor, lawyers, judicial actors, Judicial Training Institute, on international standards on freedom of expression and safety of journalists. So I'm very glad to be here today to open this first session really and talk with our other speakers. So I'll just briefly introduce Alice Gardol, lawyer and Chief of Staff, Office of Amal Clooney. I think we'll have Karuna Nundy online that will be speaking, who is Senior Advocate at the Supreme Court of India and international human rights lawyer. Eduardo Bertoni, Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the American University Washington College of Law. And Sarah Peeters from PALU, lawyers and program officer from development of the Legal Professional Pan-African Lawyer Union, which is a partner of UNESCO on many projects. Maybe I'm going to ask you this first question about what were the main key progress, you would say, in the last decade on decision of freedom of expression in link with the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular with SDG, I would say 16 on peace, justice, and strong institution. I think it's a key one, in particular the SDG 1610 on right to information and protecting of fundamental rights, which of course is reflect on freedom of expression. That would be very interesting. And also, I want to recall also a few words about why I'm so passionate about freedom of expression. First, we all know that it's a right in itself, the right to receive and part and share information and seek information and ideas. But it's also an enabling right for all other fundamental rights. So right of political participation, right to vote, right to education, right to assembly. It's deeply interlinked with freedom of expression. And so always what we try to highlight when we speak with judges and legal experts when we do capacity building program is really why it's such a nexus right, really. And I think it's extremely important to recall. And also, I would say I would go a little bit more philosophical. It's a right which is essential for us human beings to progress because we are not omniscient. So we progress by this whole process of making mistakes, trial and errors, and this is only possible because we exchange ideas with others. So the more we have this possibility to freely exchange ideas, sometimes controversial ideas, difficult ideas, ideas which are challenging, but also among all these great ideas. And so innovation is deeply linked to this right to exchange ideas and freedom of expression. And we progress as humans on all different levels because of that. So I think it's very important to recall these elements and why the legal framework needs to protect very deeply these essential rights. So I'll let my co-speaker start. If they can introduce themselves a little bit more about what they're doing, because I gave a very brief one, but I think you don't hesitate, please, to say what you're doing exactly, and then tell us your perspective on what were the key decisions, what were the key progress, I would say, in the last decade regarding freedom of expression in link with this SDGs. Thank you. I will start with you, Alice.
Thank you, Mehdi. So thank you so much to Columbia Global Freedom of Expression and UNESCO for having me today. My name's Alice Godoi. I'm Amal Clooney's Chief of Staff. I've spent the last 3.5 years with Amal working on a book that we actually just published called The Right to Freedom of Expression in International Law. It's been published at the start of this year by Oxford University Press, and Amal and Lord David Neuberger are the editors of the book. I also do a range of other human rights litigation and casework with Amal, including representing Maria Ressa, the Nobel laureate and fantastic journalist from the Philippines. So, but I've also been asked specifically to speak on the US today, so I'll also focus some of my remarks on that. I just wanted to echo what Mehdi has said about the right to freedom of expression and how it is truly a foundational right upon which all other rights hinge. Amal has only written 2 books. One is on the right to freedom of expression, and the other is on the right to a fair trial, both as kind of twin rights, which are incredibly important to being able to exercise the range of other rights that we all hold very dear. I mean, if we're thinking about a few, kind of examples, if we didn't have transparent reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic, that erodes the right to health. Without protesters and activists speaking out, the causes that they're fighting for will die in the dark. So I think that freedom of expression is a really integral link in the chain of a range of other civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights. But moving to answering the question, what are the key landmark judgments in the United States? What are links in this chain over the last decade? And I think the US is somewhat of a unique jurisdiction when we think about landmark advancements in free speech. And the reason for that is because the US has such a strong history of free speech thanks to the First Amendment, that what I would classify as the key victories in the last 10 years could be conceived of as sort of false alarms. Moments when the US Supreme Court had a real opportunity to narrow speech and chose not to do so. So I'll speak about sort of 2 sets of cases, 2 examples. The first is a set of twin cases that were decided recently by the US Supreme Court on the same day. And they're both tragic examples of cases being brought by victims of terrorist attacks, or the families of victims of terrorist attacks. In the first case, Twitter versus Tumblr, the families of these victims attempted to sue Facebook, Google, and Twitter for aiding and abetting ISIS. Their case centered around algorithms, arguing that ISIS benefits from its content being recommended by algorithms, so that increases their recruits, their fundraising, their ability to put their message out into the world. But the case would have had really sweeping implications if the families had been successful. It would have meant that Twitter was liable for terrorist attacks, even when the company had no specific knowledge that any particular post led to any particular attack. So it would have meant that recommending videos without any more amounted to aiding and abetting terrorism. There was a second case, Gonzalez versus Google, about the scope of a US law which protects social media companies from the speech of their users. This case was again brought in similar, very tragic circumstances by the family of a victim of a of someone who was killed in an ISIS terrorist attack. And the family argued that the companies should be liable when algorithms recommend ISIS content. So in both of these cases, the US Supreme Court sided with the companies. The court held that algorithms are agnostic and that finding for the families would mean that social media companies are liable for aiding and abetting each and every ISIS terrorist attack committed anywhere in the world. Now, of course, I guess some could wonder why this is a victory for the SDGs and for human rights. And while ISIS speech is clearly abhorrent, algorithms are clearly incredibly crucial for us to make sense of information on the internet. So I think that those two sets of cases are a really clear example of one of these false alarms. I'll mention briefly a second set of cases, which are key decisions by the US Supreme Court that have thankfully refused to roll back the actual malice doctrine from the seminal case of New York Times versus Sullivan. So we all know this key case. It's a bedrock of protecting the press in the United States. It says that a speaker must have acted with reckless disregard when speaking about a public figure before someone can claim for defamation. I think this case is a really critical one, not just in US courts, but in courts around the world. And that's because so many courts around the world have applied the actual malice standard. But in a lot of those courtrooms, libel laws are criminal. In over 160 countries, we still have criminal defamation laws. And what that would mean is that, say, for example, take a client like Maria Ressa, who I've worked on with Amal for many years. Maria is currently subjected to an over 6-year prison term for criminal libel for an article she didn't write, for charges brought many, many years after the article was in fact published. So I think protecting good libel laws and decriminalising bad ones is critical to SDG 16. You look at someone like Maria, who's reported on the drug wars, on corruption in the Philippines. For progress, I think her reporting is critical and valuable to the world. But in the US, calls to chip away at the actual malice doctrine have really grown. President Trump described the laws as a sham and a disgrace, and ones that he were planning to take a strong look at. And then in 2021, Justices Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch both urged the court to reconsider Sullivan. And Justice Thomas has been maintaining those calls since that time. Thankfully, none of his colleagues have agreed with him. So those are two sort of key sets of cases in which I see these are like false alarm examples that have been really landmark decisions in the US.
Thank you, Alice. Maybe Sarah, I will let you also present in your view what are these landmark decisions globally, but also maybe in Africa, where you are more focusing your work in PALU. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So yes, thanks for introducing. Sarah Peeters, working at the Pan-African Lawyers Union. Our headquarters is based in Arusha, Tanzania. I have experience with a lot of litigation before the East African Court of Justice and the African Court in specific. ECOWAS Court less, but we are aware we're partnering with them, working with them. I'm not theoretically an expert in the jurisprudence of these courts. More the practical side of things. So if you ask me the jurisprudence that jumps out, I also look at from the practical side of things. Meaning on theoretical basis, you have two approaches to the question, in my view, the theoretical approach and the practical approach. Theoretical approach, I would say the three cases that jump to mind to me is the Konate case versus Burkina Faso, where the decriminalization of defamation was introduced by the African Court, was decided upon. And then for the East African Court of Justice, I would say what was the important one for me is the Burundian Journalists Union case, in which the EACJ, East African Court of Justice, while it doesn't formally have a human rights character, a human rights jurisdiction, through the EAC treaty, he decided that he can decide on human rights violations, including this one, the freedom of expression, and has laid the path for decisions following this. So that's the African Court, the ACJ. And then for the ECOWAS Court, which I'm not that experienced about, but I would refer to the Amnesty International Togo case versus Togo, where the ECOWAS Court, I think it's in 2020, decided that access to internet is a part of the freedom of expression. So these three jump out to me. Now the more practical side of things, more impact-oriented, I would say the Konata case is really something we can learn from. And we should learn from, as in preparation of it. I think in Amicus, the PALU's part was that we joined as Amicus and that we also organized and led the other Amicus that joined the case. I think in total there were 17 Amicus, which really built the case and really provided for the court the necessary expertise where they can refer to. It's also very successful in the way that the special rapporteur of the African Commission, by then was Pansi, I believe, really made it her mission to every meeting, every mission she went to promote it, to advocate for it, for the principle of decriminalization of defamation. So I think that's also a major part of it. And part of this strategic litigation, properly built with the necessary amicus, the experience, also awareness in the field, and different actors, it seeped through the national courts as well. Kenya, Lesotho, they were all there implying this principle. So I think this is a really solid base of strategic litigation, a really good example which we should continue learning from and apply in all next steps of finding this human rights standard and trying to apply it regionally. That's my answer.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I really like your approach. It's true that, especially the Konate case, you could see how it pervaded and it influenced other courts at national level, and that's quite impressive. And we really also for the work as practitioner, you know, is to work with this regional or sub-regional court, and then how to see how this percolate, I would say, at national level later. It's very interesting, I think. Thank you. So, Eduardo, on you.
Well, okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Global Freedom of Expression, Colombia, UNESCO, for your kind invitation. I would like to start with a personal note, and then some context, and then go into developments in the case law and jurisprudence of the Inter-American system on human rights particularly, but we can expand to other regions of the world. Personal note is every time that Columbia University invited me to come to talk about freedom of expression, I came. And that is because during the 90s, the first time that I came to Columbia University was as a visiting scholar to take courses on First Amendment with Vincent Blassie. And that was my starting as a scholar on freedom of expression. Then I returned to Columbia as a human rights teaching fellow in 2001. And then I became the special rapporteur for freedom of expression and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And again, every time that something's going on freedom of expression at Columbia University, I came. And I still remember more than 20 years ago, some events in the main building on campus, and having conversation with Lee Bollinger at that time, and Agnès was there, and many people that were mentioned by Hawley at the very beginning, and that was in some way the starting point of this extraordinary program. I am very happy to be here in celebrating the 10th years, and I'm very happy that UNESCO continue to support this program as well. And it's a very important program because it helps the scholars a lot to find jurisprudence, to find case law that is not only from one country but globally. The context, I'm going to say something about the recent developments of the jurisprudence of the Inter-American system on human rights. But it's interesting to put this in context, and I explain what I want to say. When I started in 2002 as special rapporteur for freedom of expression, many people, when they ask me, well, what you do? Well, I study the Inter-American system on human rights and particularly freedom of expression decisions. And they said, particularly my colleagues in Europe, well, how many cases do you have? None. At that time, we just have the advisory opinion number 5. It is key, very important. It is today a very important opinion. But we didn't have cases decided by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights at that time. That leads to me to write up an old article, and the name of the article was something like Inter-American Court of Human Rights and European Court of Human Rights, a dialogue on freedom of expression. And in the article I said that there was not a dialogue, it was more a monologue. I mean, the Inter-American system was looking at what the European system were doing, because the developments on freedom of speech coming from Europe at that time were really good and very robust. My view is that the situation is changing. Now we have a lot of cases decided by the Inter-American system, and in on some aspects, much better. And this is something that was not the case when I started in the early 21st century. And this is important because my concern is that some developments coming from Europe and possibly from the United States, that the defending freedom of speech was very strong by past US Supreme Courts. Maybe today some people were, well, at least just said, luckily the actual malice doctrine was sustained, but many people, many scholars were very concerned about that. But I'm here to talk about the Inter-American system on human rights, and the context is the last years, during the last decade, the development on the Inter-American system is very important, was very important. And I will mention some aspects on that to tell you why I'm saying that is very important. The Inter-American Court decided some cases related to speeches that are considered relevant for a vibrant and robust debate. Particularly speech that in the past we work on political speech or speech coming from journalists or articles coming from journalists. But the court, the Inter-American Court, during the last year started protecting speech on labor and union issues, which is very important. The right to freedom of expression and protest by judges, which is another aspect that is important. What is the extension of freedom of expression coming from not public officials in general, but particularly on judges. And of course, the protection of the importance of the protection of freedom of speech of public figures, political activists, and political participation. The other thing that is really important for me, and something that Alice just mentioned when you were talking about libel laws, is that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is very strong against the use of criminal law in cases of expression. And we have, early cases. The first one was Herrera Ulloa case in 2005, 2006, but the last cases are really important to maintain that doctrine and to be very clear that criminal law is not the way to apply subsequent responsibilities in cases of freedom of expression. So this is another important thing. Also, there are cases, probably one of the main cases is a case against Ecuador, in a case started with the former president, Rafael Correa, on civil liability. The Inter-American system of human rights, particularly the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, established the importance to apply what we call the three-part test and the proportionality test. So it's okay to say no criminal law as subsequent liability, maybe civil responsibilities, but this is not a blank check. It is something that you have to apply, taking into account the three-party test and particularly the proportionality of the. Then something that Aryeh Neier mentioned at the very beginning of this meeting is related to violence and it's your program as well, Mary, is related to violence against journalists, the killings of journalists that is rampant in many countries in Latin America. Aryeh just mentioned Mexico, but we can go to other countries as well, particularly in Central America, where the situation is very dramatic. So what is important in the cases decided by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is when the court established the linkage between impunity in those cases and the problem of prevention, of the need to prevent those kind of situations. Saying in other words, to prevent the killing of a journalist, it is important that you establish in a country a structure that will not be or will not allow impunity in those cases. And that is a real problem because impunity is very high still. But the current case law, the current correspondence of the court, of the Inter-American Court, says that impunity is an attack, is a violation of freedom of expression because it is not, it is not established as a way to prevent these kind of crimes. The other advance that is really important, it came very recently, is a case against Colombia, the Jeanette Bedoya case, which is a case against a woman journalist. And it's very clear in the jurisprudence of the court that the women that practice journalism in Latin America are unprotected, and the court stressed this problem and highlighted the importance to create mechanisms to protect women when they are practicing journalism. And what is very interesting in the jurisprudence of the court, at least for me, is when they establish the importance to have women practicing journalism because they add another voice that if it is banned because of attacks, because of threats, because of harassment, is a voice that we are not going to be able to hear. And I'm almost finishing, Mary, so don't worry. There are two other things that are very recent. One is the importance of freedom of expression of whistleblowers, work and the fight against corruption. This is a very new case. It's the Viteri case versus Ecuador. It's really important. UNESCO and I was working on whistleblowers, and we presented in Uruguay last year or 2 years ago a paper on whistleblowers and freedom of expression, the importance of granting freedom of expression to people that denounce corruption even when they are within institutions like the military, right? So it's another development coming from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And the last one is, again, a very recent case that for the first time, the Inter-American Court established that the personal data or that protect personal data is part of the right to privacy, is part of is human rights, and the relationship between protecting your privacy and as a way to protect your freedom of expression is something that is embedded in this last decision. So those are, for me, many of the advancement coming from the Inter-American system in human rights. It's really important UNESCO work when you are spreading this jurisprudence among judges in the region, and hopefully they apply at the domestic level this kind of standards that is, I think, the main goal of doing this work with judges in different jurisdictions. So I have stopped here. Maybe we can talk about challenges and the trends of the future afterwards.
Thank you, Eduardo. So maybe now we can have Karuna Nundy. I think she can intervene online, isn't it? Oh, yes. Wonderful. Hello, Karuna. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mehdi. There are challenges today, I think, that many of us are keenly aware of to free speech around the world. In the rise of sovereignty, there has been a significant rollback, I think, of international law standards. But the role of comparative law, I think, then becomes even more significant. And it is here that the role of Colombia's Global Freedom of Expression team, anchored in this entire decade by Hawley so ably, must be congratulated. I have contributed as much as I could from time to time, along with the other legal experts on this committee. But the able leadership of Hawley, as well as Agnes Catalina, and the founding leadership of Lee Bollinger has been just stellar. The prize, I think, to lawyers and for judicial decisions has also been very encouraging to actors around the world, as well as UNESCO's support, I think, in resourcing all of this has really been quite indispensable. So thank you. I am a member of this committee, yes. And I'm also a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. We are the independent advisory body of the Media Freedom Coalition that Lord Justice David Neuberger heads, and Amal Clooney was highly instrumental in founding. In this regard, allying with this Columbia Committee, we launched almost exactly this time last year, around World Press Freedom Day, a report on blasphemy and the interface with hate speech, also looking at the standards globally on hate speech and how many countries in the world don't meet them as yet, including a number of countries in the global north. So we've been doing trainings, including through the Bonavera Institute at Oxford, with UNESCO again, of judges and prosecutors and legal experts through MOOCs, training them in international standards so that they can better meet the challenges that are before us today. I speak today, though, not only as an international lawyer and as a committee expert, but also as an alumna of Columbia Law School and a Human Rights Fellow of 2001. So this university has really shaped me as an advocate for freedom of expression in multiple ways. The right of students to protest, the freedom of speech and association is of course encompassed by Articles 19 and 20 of the ICCPR. So long as there is no incitement to discrimination or violence or hatred, none of which has currently been demonstrated at Columbia. Proportionality of the penalty is of course key. Criminal action for speech here, it seems to me, does not meet the standards of Articles 19 and 20 of the International Convention of Civil and Political Rights and must be rolled back. I stand then with the Human Rights Institute and the large number of faculty members that have risked their livelihoods to stand with freedom of speech and association. I do not speak for the committee, let me be clear. I speak for myself. But I do believe that the charges against the students must be dropped. They must be reinstated to their schooling, housing, and scholarships if any. Now, the last decade in terms of how the various decisions have impacted the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's been interesting. And I think what was particularly interesting about this panel was the question on how Goal 13 on climate action has been impacted. Because of course, as a number of the panelists have pointed out, speech, freedom of expression are the pipes that tell us what's going wrong with our polity, what's going right, what are the problems, who are the most vulnerable people affected, what can governments and other actors do to address these problems, and that's the second step. We see around the world that there is an increasing conflict between those that sometimes fund governments, and we have a problem of corporate funding of political parties across the world, and climate justice. So I'm going to address some of those judgments in particular, in addition, of course, to speak about the more Grundnorm, more fundamental issues that surround the freedom of expression. And I will maybe stick to my time, I promise. Now, the criminal provisions, as Eduardo was mentioning, limiting expression in this region, broadly Asia and the Asia Pacific, I beg your pardon. Many of these have traveled with colonialism. So many countries in this region have continued to have a penal code that derives from a Victorian penal code that originated in the United Kingdom. So you have, for example, a common Section 295A in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, I think also very similar provisions actually in Malaysia and Singapore that speak of insult to religion. Unfortunately, many of these have not been repealed, which may surprise one, because when you look at colonial provisions and you look at the project of decolonization, legal decolonization, one would think that this would be the first issue to address, because of course the colonial power is not as interested in hearing what the polity has to say, because that's not why they govern. They're much more interested in keeping the peace within various factions and groups, in particular religious factions. In Shreya Singhal versus the Union of India, which in which I was one of the lead counsel to argue the case, we were addressing a provision that was brought in to the Information Technology Act way after colonialism was rolled back. And what's interesting is that Section 66A was even broader, even vaguer, to the extent that any speech that was vague, I beg your pardon, any speech that was annoying at the lowest threshold could be criminalized. And your local constable would decide what was annoying. Locus standi as to who could bring a complaint wasn't really spoken of, so anyone really could bring a complaint. And we saw many of these complaints being brought. So annoyance and inconvenience then at the lowest threshold became the list that we were arguing against. The main issue was whether it violated the right to freedom of expression guaranteed under Article 19(1)A of the Constitution of India. The court first discussed the three fundamental concepts in understanding the freedom of expression: discussion, advocacy, and incitement. And according to the court, and this is important in today's context, mere discussion or even advocacy of a particular case, howsoever unpopular, is at the heart of the right. And the law may curtail the freedom only when discussion or advocacy amounts to incitement. In addition, we also challenged the very broad intermediary guidelines which required pre-publication censorship by private actors, private intermediaries. And the order we got was extremely speech protective and stands to this day. So political and other similar speech is protected by orders, protected to the extent that only by an order of a competent court can speech be taken down on the internet. Today, even though we had a bit of a brain's trust while we were litigating this case, today I wonder whether this is broad, because our court system is limited and the internet is huge, and whether or not a notice and takedown regime might not have been more advisable. But that's a question that will be revisited in litigation again. Of course, as Aryeh Neier mentioned, internet shutdowns are very common in India. Indeed, India is the leader in internet shutdowns in the world. There was very good litigation in the Supreme Court. Anuradha Bhasin's judgment said that a review committee must be established and all orders relating to internet shutdowns must be published, and which would give the required promptness and transparency to challenge these orders. Unfortunately, it's not happening in a timely fashion, obscuring details on the legality and the validity of these shutdowns. An interesting case with regard to climate change was recently discussed in the Lahore High Court in Pakistan. And in Asghar Leghari was a farmer, and he brought a public investigation claiming that the state's laid-back attitude towards implementing the National Climate Policy of 2012 and the framework for implementation of climate policy 2014 to 2013 violated his constitutional right to life, because they weren't doing it fast enough and strongly enough, but also his right to a healthy and clean environment, because climate change, of course, presents serious threats to water, food, and energy security around the world, but also in Pakistan. Citing domestic and international legal principles, the court determined that the delay and lethargy of the state in implementing the framework offends the fundamental rights of citizens. And the court reasoned that the constitutional rights to life and human dignity under Articles 19 and 14 of the Pakistan Constitution, the right to life and health, etc., includes the right to a healthy and clean environment. So interpretation of these fundamental rights must be guided by the constitutional values of democracy, equality, and social, economic, and political justice, and international and environmental principles of sustainable development, the precautionary principle, and intergenerational and intra-generational equity, as well as the doctrine of public trust. In its final order, the court nominated climate justice as the successor of environmental justice. Environmental justice at the court revolved around enforcing national laws with decisions informed by international legal principles. Climate justice, as the court envisioned it, adopted a human-centered approach, and it linked human rights with development. This region, of course, has been quite a leader in terms of economic and social rights, whereas understanding that you cannot decide such rights in as hard a way as civil and political rights. But a couple of days ago on...
Karuna, I'm sorry to be the horrible cop there, but it's just because otherwise we'll want to have much time for the other questions. So maybe I'll let you finish, and then we.
So let me wrap up.
Yeah,
let me wrap up. I think I'm glad that Alice spoke of the Rappler judgment. We have Maria Ressa, of course, is a brilliant and inspiring person who has been not just involved with furthering human rights in the Philippines, but also I think her work at Rappler and her work around the world has furthered international law in multiple ways. Along with Amal and Alice, Diane Desierto, a number of other lawyers have been working on this case and their efforts, I think, must very much be supported. Why don't we address the rest of the trends and in questions and discussion?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karuna. So, yeah, we were mentioning about how it actually, all this work, how to say, has an impact in a way. I think there's, from our experience on the ground, of training and capacity building and interacting with judicial actors, I think one of the progress I can see is also just to put the issue of freedom of expression on the top of the agenda of these actors, which honestly is not a given. Because, you know, there's so many issues in the world and they have to deal with so many, they have to adjudicate so many cases. So for us to have the feedback, for example, we work with the International Association of Prosecutors, and to have the feedback from them saying, I don't know how you did it, but you put freedom of expression and safety of journalists on the top of the agenda for us, along corruption, fighting against corruption and things like this. And it was not the case 3 years ago or 4 years ago. So that's we consider some kind of, you know, little small victories, small step in the right direction. And it is, I think, important to highlight also this thing, because these judicial actors, on personal level, they might also find that journalists are exaggerating and there's too many bad journalism and etc. They might have these kind of ideas, you know, and sometimes it's justified, you know, but still they have a critical role in protecting this right, and journalists play an essential role in the enactment of this right. So I think it's important to highlight that. The other thing is related to the Colombia database. For example, when we do a capacity building workshop, recently I was in India, actually I was in Bangalore doing one with prosecutor, which was very interesting. It was, they asked, the public prosecutor asked to have journalists for the whole time together, which I was very surprised, because normally to have them both in the room for 3 days, not a good idea. But they really insisted, you know, so we had 10 journalists and we had 25 prosecutor, and it worked very well. And of course, it starts like a group therapy, but it was really interesting. And we used this case, for example, from the database, the Ramirez against Venezuela, with the story of this former military talking about a flamethrower. If it has been used in you know, against some cadet, it would have been a crime, and he was prosecuted. And so we anonymized the case, and then we asked them to make a moot court, dividing the room in 3 groups: the prosecutors, the defender, and the judge, and see how they apply these tools where we're talking about the 3-part test and everything, and give the feedback. And after, we show the decision by the regional court. And I think it's important also to use the database in that way also, with very concrete case from regional court, and say, okay, here are how these regional court, human rights court, apply these different instruments. I'll close there. But now maybe we are going to my second question will actually wrap up two questions regarding what are the gaps that you can see from your perspective, and what are these new trends? What are the trends that we see? And I'll give us also our perspective on this issue, but I'll let Alice please go ahead.
Thanks. So, you know, I think as many people have said today, I think there's backsliding all over the world in terms of freedom of expression, and I think, you know, this week really speaks to that. But if I'm confining myself to US jurisprudence, I think the main setback that I think is worthwhile mentioning is on national security speech, and how critical that is to SDG 16. You know, I think it's a real blind spot in the US's free speech jurisprudence, and I think the case that is the most emblematic of that is, of course, the indictment of Julian Assange under the US Espionage Act. The US Espionage Act has existed for decades, but prior to 2009, it was rarely used to prosecute whistleblowers. And of course, that wasn't for a lack of whistleblowing. A number of the key revelations that we know about the US have come from whistleblowers. For example, the atrocities that happened at the Abu Ghraib detention center. So it wasn't from a lack of leaks. But then after 2009, we saw both the Obama and Trump administrations increase prosecutions under the Espionage Act at a really unprecedented rate. But all of these prosecutions had something in common. It was that they were prosecutions against government employees or contractors, such as Edward Snowden, for leaks that they then passed on to journalists who were the ultimate publishers. So that is why I think Assange's case is so significant, because it's the first example of a publisher who's been indicted under the US Espionage Act. And he's been indicted for publishing a very small subset of what was actually published on WikiLeaks, which is the names of human intelligence sources. Now, as we all know, newsrooms across the world have stood by Assange. They've, in the words of the former editor of the Washington Post, Assange's indictment criminalises common practices in journalism that have long served the public interest. Again, we all know that Assange has been locked in this 5-year legal battle for his extradition, and there's been a number of recent developments in that. In March, the UK High Court delayed the final ruling on whether he can appeal, and while this is a temporary reprieve for Assange, the court made some very troubling remarks about the public interest in his and WikiLeaks disclosures. They sort of took a very narrow view of his fundamental argument that it was in the public interest to know all the information leaked by WikiLeaks. The judges held that there was a strong public interest in protecting the identities of the human intelligence sources and no countervailing public interest justification for publication, which we all know completely disregards many of the public interest disclosures that came out through WikiLeaks, for example, the abuses at Guantanamo Bay. So, this decision is at odds, of course, with a sea of growing voices calling for an end to Assange's prosecution. I'm originally an Australian lawyer. The Australian government has recently called for a plea deal. Lawmakers passed a resolution in February calling for the matter to come to an end. There's been some really strong remarks by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Irene Khan, talking about the dangerous precedent that Assange's case has both in the US and across the world. So I strongly agree with this sentiment, and I think we should keep Assange's case really at the top of the list of an example of a case that can have a huge chilling effect across the world. But to answer the question on what I see are key trends moving forward, I'll mention a couple, because I know we're running out of time. The first trend, I think, is really important to draw attention to, and I think a few people have mentioned this already, but it's a trend that we're not even going to be able to get to courtrooms as litigators and human rights lawyers representing journalists, because journalists are being killed before we get to that place. We've had journalists murdered in the heart of Europe, from Malta to Slovakia. We're very honoured to have Paul later today speaking on behalf of his and in honour of his mum, Daphne. I think the latest count for journalists that have been killed in Gaza, Palestinian journalists, is 92, which is just a staggering figure. We previously discussed, I think, countries with the largest amount of journalists being murdered, but of course in the last 6 months that number has completely changed. In Maria Ressa's case, it's one of my jobs to look at how many journalists have been murdered in the Philippines since Marcos came to power. In a democracy in peacetime, that number should be 0, and it's 4 since 2022. So I just want to honour and how brave the people are that we're speaking about today and seeking to serve. And then finally, I think another key trend that we're seeing, a really complex trend, is how to deal with misinformation in jurisprudence. The time period that we're in will be defined as the moment that generative AI was able to create deep fakes at sort of an astonishing, incredible rate and accuracy. But also this year, we're in a year where over 70 countries, more than half the world's population, are going to be going to the polls to vote in elections. So I think this is a really, really critical moment to be able to work out how to deal with this misinformation. But I also think the reality is that misinformation jurisprudence is novel. there's not a lot of it outside of the realms of sort of thinking about false speech through the lens of defamation, actually. But it's also clear that you can't just restrict a falsehood because it's false under international law. So we're going to need to apply the same sort of harm, intent, causation requirements as we have done to other speech for misinformation. But I think, hopefully, the trend that we'll see is jurisprudence in regional bodies, in national courts, rise to meet what is a very chilling occasion with the rise of misinformation in the generative AI world.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. Sarah, please, I would like to hear your perspective.
Very short, I understand. I think, again, from a very practical point of view, because all the information is present, really, the book and the special collection papers for Columbia University have it all very good oversight and analysis. But what I really wanted to put in this debate, which I think we shouldn't go without, is the struggle of regional courts in the continent on implementation. So it's a setback in the sense that it's never been good. So there's still a lot of work there. I think in 2021, even the African court said that there's only 7% implementation rate of their decisions, which is horribly, horribly low and very discouraging for litigants and then for the legal profession in its whole, of course. And this is something we really should have a closer look at and really come together and join forces in it, because it's so important. At this level, regional level, there's so many important issues at stake that you can't, before you start, you have to know that something's going to change, because otherwise, why would you bother? So the discouragement is there. We should really focus on getting that implementation rate up, especially for the African court. I don't know if people in the room know, but before individuals and NGOs can prosecute, so file a procedure before the African court against their state, the state has to be part of the protocol of the African court, and they also have to file a declaration, and only at this point 8 states have done so. So only against 8 states, individuals and NGOs can file these cases, which is very low and, again, very discouraging. Another issue, of course, is the backlog, because these courts don't have permanent judges. So I think I've checked the website a little bit. East African Court of Justice, African Court, they both have like a rate of 60% of their cases being finalized. So there's also still a lot of things to be done. But then from a PALU perspective, and this is what I want to continue Ella's conversation with, is what we face if we try to litigate these cases for protection of journalists. First step that comes into our mind is, okay, if the client comes to us, if they're willing, how do we protect them? And these programs are so limited, and you often are in a position that you can't promise protection, which is also a big barrier before we can actually proceed with the case. So getting the clients to first trust in the judicial system with this implementation rate is difficult, but then again also promise this security, this safety is a whole different issue. And another, from a PALU perspective, another difficulty is capacity. You have these judges who are not permitted judges, so there's a backlog, but it's also a capacity issue with lawyers. Again, at this stage, regional level, the importance is so high, and a lot of these cases get thrown out on technicalities. So this is also what PALU tries to do, to share the expertise on regional level for lawyers, to try to train and try to get in the nitty-gritty of litigating before this court, so these important cases don't get thrown out based on these technicalities, which is obviously such a shame. So I think these 3 issues are the major difficulties the legal profession and the judiciary faces. But I think, again, if efforts are joined, especially also with UNESCO's activities, I think there's an MOU with the East African Court of Justice and the trainings with the African Court as well with PALU, I think it's manageable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, you're completely right about this this capacity building and technicalities, because each court has its own rules and status of limitation, and to present the cases. Like the East African court is very short; it's 3 months. But they also have advantages, like the ECOWAS court. You don't need to go to exhaust at national level. So, to be quite expert in their procedure, I think is very important, critical. And yes, we have MOUs with these courts. And when we actually usually do trainings we have one judge from this court presenting the jurisprudence and these specific technicalities. We try to involve them because some of the judge, they just don't know. It's not that they don't want, but they don't know. And that, I think, we have to make the difference. Sometimes they just don't have the possibilities. We know that in some circumstances, some states, they don't have the window. Some they do, and they are willing to take the step, the concrete step. I'll let Eduardo, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Mary, you asked about gaps, challenges, and new trends. I will be brief. I don't want to be misunderstood when I'm going to say what I'm going to say. I mean, when I'm talking today about gap, challenges, and new trends, I'm focusing on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Why I'm saying that? Because there is a lot of development in the Inter-American system on human rights coming from the Office of the Special Rapporteur, the work that Catalina Botero did, that Edison Lanza did, that currently Pedro Vaca is doing as special rapporteurs in their reports, talking about many of the things that I'm going to mention today, or doing reports on that, the work of civil society and organizations in Colombia, FLIP with Jonathan Bog, in Argentina, CELE with Agustina del Campo, the local offices of Article 19. So there is a huge development, all the things that I'm going to mention, but there is a gap in the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So cases probably will come, hopefully, and hopefully will come in a good direction. But talking about gaps, the Inter-American Court didn't develop yet Article 13.5 on hate speech. This is something that we need at the Inter-American system. The limits or something very concrete about freedom of expression and the interpretation of Article 13.5, I put under the title of hate speech. This is something that we don't have yet. Also, something that Alice also mentioned, we didn't talk before, but it is national security and freedom of speech. How you are going to limit some speeches because of national security. Is that possible? Is not possible? Remember that the Inter-American System of Human Rights, Article 13.1, point 2 says very clearly prior censorship is prohibited. So what if you have an expression that could put in danger national security? Should we have some sort of Pentagon case in the Inter-American system? I don't know. This is something that the court didn't decide it yet. And then something that began with the case that I mentioned against Colombia on the Colectivo de Abogados Javier Restrepo on personal data privacy and freedom of speech. This is a case, a very new case, but it will need more development in the linkage between privacy and freedom of expression that is still not strong jurisprudence. We don't have jurisprudence in the court. And then when we talk about new trends, there is an elephant in the room for the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, which is freedom of expression and technology, to put under a very big title, okay? And within that title is, at some point, the Inter-American system, and particularly the Inter-American Court, will have cases that linkage between that analyze the linkage between some technologies and freedom of expression. To quote something or to mention something here, problems on LLMs, not LLMs standing, LLMs, large language models, artificial intelligence, and defamation. What if what if we have defamation cases coming from LLM and not coming from human being? How we are going to analyze that? Access to the internet and freedom of expression. We don't have a case at the Inter-American system saying that the linkage between freedom of expression and access to internet is very close or is embedded in freedom of expression. Yes, we have a case decided recently that give the possibility in the analog world to indigenous communities to have their own, community radios. Yes, we have a case on that, but we don't have cases on the digital world. So this is another thing on technology and freedom of expression. Media platform regulations or content regulation. This is something you mentioned, Alice, or someone here about prior censorship or private censorship or something like that. So we don't have a case that works on that in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And the last thing that is coming or should come or will come is the possibility or is anonymity as part of freedom of expression and encryption. This is the new thing. We sustain for many years that express your thoughts in an anonymous way is part of freedom of expression. Well, what happened with encryption? We had a recent case coming from the European Court of Human Rights that said encryption is okay. I mean, it's part of freedom of expression, so the government cannot oblige a company to not to have an encryption or an encrypted way to communicate. But why I'm saying that, and I finished, Mary, on the trends, because many of these technologies, and this is part of the history of human beings, when you have a new technology, people try to adapt, sometimes scared about the new technology. And I wonder, or my concern, to say more precisely, is how the tribunals are going to react to these challenges. Are we going to abandon the fundamentals of freedom of speech because of these technologies, because we are scared of what could happen with, misinformation, disinformation, some of the things, or we are going to do a huge effort to maintain the fundamentals of freedom of speech and be careful not to create some sort of standards that could be a slippery slope or could create a slippery slope problem, because we try to solve some of the problems that we are facing today because of the new technologies, but that at the end will impact in our right to express freely. So that is my view on the things.
Wow, very, very interesting. Very interesting reflection. Yeah, I think the issue of liability with AI, I think it's going to be a huge problem for judicial actors to how to determine that, how to make, who is accountable. Yeah. That's a big question mark. So I'll let Karuna, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mehdi. Recently, we've been seeing threats to lawyers, which has really been going to the root of rule of law in general, but also to the freedom of expression. In the case of Jose Zamora, for example, the Guatemalan president of El Periódico, I met with, online, I met with his son recently, and they had to change lawyers 10 times. 10 times. Keelan Gallagher, who is also part of the team representing Jimmy Lai, also Maria Ressa, has been sanctioned by the Chinese government. Now, all of this has a massive chilling effect. And when Shakespeare said, "First kill all the lawyers," he didn't refer to our lot as because, we were seen as venal or anything in that particular Henry VIII play. It was about how lawyers are one of the first bastions for civil liberties, right? And I think that this is something we need to look at very closely, which the high-level panel has. And I refer you to reports on Magnitsky sanctions and visa protections, and consular protections. A second problem is more conceptual. A number of times when a media house or a journalist is being attacked, you see ancillary attacks, right? Like you see an attack on their tax reporting, for example. And it's very difficult then to classify that as a freedom of expression problem, which means that the international regime doesn't get triggered because, of course, the sovereign nation that is prosecuting the media house or journalist then says that, well, let due process take its course. It's got nothing to do with you. And it's very difficult for an international body to then substitute that due process and look, for example, at arbitrary detention and other such protections more than at a very limited threshold sort of standards. I'm going to also speak about national security because it's so important and because Jimmy Lai's case has been so egregious. And of course, we must remember that it was in the context of challenging the national security law and seeking foreign intervention on it that he himself was accused under the same law. But I think that Jimmy Lai's case also highlights a more sinister trend. And that trend is courts paying deference, I think, to governments when there's a national security case and applying a very hands-off sort of standard, including looking at evidence in the Jimmy Lai case that would not have otherwise been admissible at trial, right? And that, I think, is a problem across the board. With regard to AI, as usual, technology is galloping ahead of regulation and ahead of our courts. I think our courts and legal systems don't really understand fully the huge problems that artificial intelligence is already presenting. For example, in a New York court, there were cases that were made up and submitted, and these were what is called hallucinations in the world of artificial intelligence. And the court then cracked down and got, very annoyed with the people who had submitted the brief. But not only, I think Naomi Klein's work is very interesting on this. I think that access to speech and access, perhaps even to justice, actually, is going to be more limited for those who are less advantaged because the inequalities are going to increase more. And as a legal community that works on free speech, I think this is something that is very much a priority. Now, I'm going to end with the right to protest because many of us were sort of brought together, including representatives from the United Nations about 7 or 8 years ago to formulate a specific right to protest that includes difficult problems like civil disobedience, which includes very specific guidelines. And I think that not just because of today, but because of the specific challenge that this presents around the world, it would be very important and interesting to formulate that very specific right. Thank you.
Thank you, Karuna. So I would like to share also with member of the panel and the room one of the trends we have observed, and we are actually working on it. I spoke about it when I came here in May, and we had a session at Columbia during WordPress Freedom Day. Is the rise of, or at least what we notice, is the type of indirect censorship against journalists, and that's very worrisome. Is the use of accusation against media and journalists, which have nothing to do with freedom of expression, but a way to silence them. Tax irregularity, money laundering, etc. And that has been used, it's very convenient, I would say, for some states and some authorities to use that because it's a bit infamous, it's very difficult to defend yourself, you need a content, you need a very strong expertise, and the accusation is very by itself is questioning the integrity of the journalists and the media. So the use of this kind of tactics that we have observed, I think is very worrisome, and we are working on an issue brief on that. But following that, I think we really need to work with judges and prosecutors and to really the same way it's been done now, I think, more and more on SLAP, on the way they can be used. The judicial system are being used to silence, basically, or misused to silence freedom of expression. I think it's something we noticed, and I think it's something important. But now we'll let we don't have much time, and unfortunately, I mean, it's always super interesting and we'd get carried on. Questions for the panelists, I think that's the moment, I think, to open, if there's any from the room. Now or never. Okay, so if there's no questions, I think we can end really right on time for Hawley at 12 sharp. So thanks a lot, dear panelists. Thanks, Karuna, for intervening from abroad, and then I will let Hawley start the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehdi.